It's already started, and time waits for no man or woman, particularly at the Rīga Conference. Therefore, I am not going to hang around and wait for everyone to turn up, and hopefully the voice and the image on the TV screens outside will encourage people to turn up a little faster. So, this afternoon, and for this now under an hour, we're going to talk about is the Green Deal spillover effects. And you know, in this region often, when we talk about energy, we talk about Nord Stream 2, or Gazprom, or energy cut-offs, leverage. This is a different conversation, looking at a more broader range for the future. To look at the potential spillover effects of the Green Deal itself, the potential for economic supercharging of the European economy, the impact of the upcoming COP26 on the development of an effective response to climate change. And to discuss all of these issues, we've got a really excellent panel of three speakers. First of all, we've got Valdis Dombrovskis, the Vice President of the European Commission, charged with dealing with these issues, David Moran, the UK COP26 Regional Ambassador, and Nick Redmond from Oxford Analytica. So we've got a really excellent panel, and hopefully we're going to have a really, really positive discussion, and ideally we'd like to get the audience involved as well. Now, what we're going to do, I think, here is very simple, is that I'm going to ask the three speakers to open with initial comments, 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll try to go into a bit of a debate, and then we'll open it to the floor. So without further ado, Mr. Vice President, if you'd like to start.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation to speak at the Riga Conference. Well, maybe let me start with a general point on the European Green Deal, because indeed it's something which will determine our policies in coming years and probably even decades. We have set the goal for climate neutrality as of 2050. We came with substantially more ambitious emission reduction targets for 2030, so 55% emission reduction target. We are devoting very substantial financial resources for those goals. So if you look at the EU's multi-annual budget from 2021 to 2027, it's 30%, which must be devoted to the issues related with the climate change. And if you look specifically at European Economic Recovery Plan, Recovery and Resilience Facility, it's 37% of Recovery and Resilience Facility which must be devoted to climate-related issues. So indeed, it's going to be one of the EU's flagship policies.
So where do you think one of the issues is that there is simply the scale of the capital which is going to have to be mobilized for the transformation. So one of the questions I think is to start with is simply the sheer amount of capital and how the Union can help mobilize that capital. That's one of the questions that immediately struck me in this. And how easy do you think that's going to be? Because I mean, the numbers. I mean, one of the numbers I picked out of this, when you look at it in some detail, is an extra 380 billion euro a year, and that's quite a lot of extra cash just for the Union.
Indeed, the estimates of necessary financing which is needed to reach the targets of European Green Deal are indeed very high. Those vary depending how you look, but indeed we are talking about a few hundreds of billions of euros of additional investment which is needed per year over the next decade. So public financing will do its part. I already mentioned how much of the EU budget is devoted to those goals. Of course, EU member states are doing their part with the green budgeting, with other initiatives, but it will be private finance, private sector, which will have to provide the scale. And that's why already since 2018, we are working on EU sustainable finance strategy and action plan to ensure that we can steer private finance to those green and sustainable goals. For this, investors need clarity on what they are investing. So we are developed the EU taxonomy or classification system of green financial activities, which is the world's first classification system of this kind. We adjusted reporting requirements to provide both the information on how climate change affects companies' finances, what financial risks it presents, and also how in turn companies' actions are affecting climate and environment. We provide information and inquire about the priorities of sustainability preferences of investors when they are investing in different economic activities. European financial institutions are setting up their strategies in line with the targets of European Green Deal. One can talk about a European Investment Bank, European Bank of Reconstruction of Development. We have a Sustainable Europe Investment Plan with a planned financing of 1 trillion euros. So there are many initiatives, but indeed the scale of transformation is very substantial. So it will require mobilization both of public and private finance.
Yeah, I think part of the key is that it's going to be a public-private partnership, because the state and the union on its own, the institutions, cannot possibly bring this into operation. And I suppose part of it's also to do with that you need a lot of new market mechanisms, which will actually probably be created actually by the banks, by the financial institutions to channel capital, and where the union will actually not necessarily play their principal role.
Indeed, if you look of one of the EU financial instruments, InvestEU, it acts exactly in line with this logic, which basically it helps to de-risk to the extent investment for a private sector with some kind of a first loss absorption guarantees and other elements. And so we can use a limited amount of public finance to crowd in substantially higher amounts of private finance. That's exactly the logic of InvestEU, how it's working, and it's actually a substantial part of the Sustainable Investment Europe plan, which I just mentioned.
That's really interesting and quite helpful. Perhaps, David, of course, we look at it more broadly. We've got the COP26 upcoming, and the potential to kickstart a lot of initiatives and to push forward the agenda. And of course, the UK as the host is leading on a lot of this. And perhaps you could give us your kind of initial observations on and context as to how we should now proceed.
Well, thank you very much. It is indeed very close to Glasgow. It's a little over a couple of weeks now, and it might be helpful to offer a little bit of context in which the EU Green Deal will be operating in the near future. And Glasgow, of course, the outcome of Glasgow provides the framework, hopefully, in which EU climate ambition and global climate ambition will operate for years. It's, as newspapers have been saying all over the world, this is the best chance we have to keep average global temperatures under control in the long term. And that requires immediate action, as the very stark warnings in the IPCC report pointed out, finding that the world is indeed warming much faster than we anticipated, and that there is no alternative to immediate action if we want to avoid the catastrophic multiplier effect of the extreme weather events we're already seeing at the moment. The EU, from the UK presidency point of view, the EU's ambition, as showcased in the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package, is extremely welcome, because we'll need leadership from everyone, but major players like the EU and including the member states are going to be absolutely critical if we're to be close to where we need to be at Glasgow. And so the 55 by 2030 commitment is very positive. That said, and there's no doubt that significant progress has been made in the last couple of years. I think countries, when we took up the presidency preparation role in 2019, countries with net zero targets accounted for about 30% of global GDP. That's now up to 80%. But recent analyses from the UN and the IEA show quite clearly that the short-term commitments, the 2030 commitments that have been made up until the end of July, at least, are insufficient. The IEA, I think, just said recently that if those commitments are implemented, they will only reduce emissions by 40% of what we need to get carbon neutrality by 2050. So that's, it begs the question, where are we for Glasgow? Now, there have been some significant commitments since then, and I know that the way of things at international summits like Glasgow is we can expect a lot of heads of states and government to save their announcement for the moment on the stage. And all I can say is I hope that the collective the collective action which is announced at Glasgow is sufficient to address what the science says is needed. And it's quite clear what we want as the UK presidency. We will be brokering the highest possible level of ambition. We've got no interest in a lowest common denominator role. But it is a consensus framework, and so the only way that we're going to get a package at Glasgow which is ambitious enough is to have spent the time up to the end of the summit listening and coming up with a package which is just and inclusive and enjoys the support of every single country. And I think we all have a role to play in making that conversation work. I totally agree that Glasgow isn't just an environmental summit. It's very much an economic summit, it's a social summit, it's a gender summit, it's a security summit. And more than that, it's how we are going to live our lives from this point on, summit. So, you know, long advocated the mainstreaming of climate policies into the policies that that we're undertaking for COVID recovery, economic and social and security factors as well. And this is where a framework like the Green Deal, a holistic approach like the Green Deal, comes in, because you have to look at it from all angles. Glasgow's going to experience, I mean, intense scrutiny, and it already is facing it, and that's great, because the larger the conversation, the better the solution. And it involves participants from business, from civil society, from youth groups, and individuals, and they all have much to contribute, including through their own net zero targets. We've boiled, because it's so broad, the UK presidency has boiled the main areas of climate work down to three. One is the mitigation area, the cutting of emissions and speeding of the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Adaptation, the protection of nature and vulnerable communities. And then, as we've been talking about, unlocking climate finance for developing countries in particular. It's clear most of the money will come from private sources, but it can certainly be stimulated and encouraged by public commitments as well. And some of that is public climate finance commitments. The commitment that we made at Copenhagen collectively way back when of $100 billion per year for climate finance has yet to be met. And I'm hoping that at Glasgow we will be as close as possible to that goal. Probably not meet it this time, but maybe next year. So as much of the Green Deal aligns with all of this, boosting renewables, binding targets for reducing energy use, phasing out internal combustion engines by 2035. That's all really useful. But as it evolves, the Fit for 55 package goes through the consultative legislative processes, then international partners will of course be watching. But whatever the results, it's clear that it sends a signal of intent, which is important both within and beyond the EU. And I'll just end up these initial remarks by saying the UK presidency starts in November, so we have a whole year of follow-up before we pass the baton to the presidency for COP27. So there will be opportunities for us to work together with Europe on climate action. But most immediately, our objective is to get the 197 delegations to do enough to protect the planet and leave the environment in a fit condition for future generations.
That's a really great opening comment to give a kind of broad ambition we've got here. One of the thoughts which immediately struck me was, as you were speaking, was one of the difficulties surely is with a lot of developing countries. Whilst it's not focused on, a lot of the commitments are actually focused on developed countries. I think part of the issue is that whilst you can see that one of the positive spillover effects, if the developed economies do a lot of the investment, they make all the change, they create all the real, if you like, push. There can be positive economic spillover effects in developing countries. But also, there's also the question of how do developing countries really access the new technologies? And how do they, because the problem with all of this is it's all great, it'll work in the West, it'll work in China, it'll work in the EU and the US, but the cost of that technology, being able to change. And so that creates a question in terms of consensus amongst all the 196 states of how far we are able to provide them with both the economic, regulatory, and technology transfer support, which would be, and how key do you think that is in the development of the?
Oh, it's absolutely key. I mean, two of the three areas that I went through, the adaptation to help. Well, all of us, it's not just developing countries who are, of course, affected by climate impacts, but help all of us to adapt and indeed prosper in the face of climate change. And the climate finance one is, they're essential parts of the deal. I mean, you won't that climate ambition from them in terms of cutting emissions and accelerating their energy transition if they can't afford it.
Yeah.
If they can't see a way through, if they don't have the technology or the financial or technical needs. So part of the Glasgow package and part of our broader work beyond COP26 is to make sure that all of the initiatives, all of the networks, all of the processes that exist, including mainstreaming through multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, are used to help create a climate action framework which works for developing countries as well as for us.
Yeah.
And it's hard graft, but it has to be done.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, perhaps switching to our esteemed economist, with a potential skeptical eye on all of this. Is it deliverable? Can we do this? What do we do? So I leave it to the skeptical economist to give his view now. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. I thought initially I might make some remarks about the Green New Deal's impact on the EU's place in the world. But it comes on to this, and I think you've raised a very important point just then with regard to developing world. So what are the positives? This is a big, ambitious, comprehensive plan. And EU has done more than any other region in the world to actually cut emissions over the last 10 years or so. So there's a first mover advantage that counts double there in terms of the EU going out into the world and trying to encourage others to follow some of the steps that are taken. But when we look at the Green New Deal, I think there are a few aspects of it that it seemed to me could be problematic as the EU goes out and tries to spread the message. And the first one is actually around this net zero 2050 target, which is of course one that's been adopted by many advanced states. Now, the rationale behind that is obviously a good one, the idea we should all drive to this target as soon as possible. But if you sit in India, you see things rather differently. The Indians will tell you that they have much lower per capita CO2 emissions than Europe or the United States does, and that their cumulative emissions since the industrial age are much, much lower. So we know that there is a finite amount of carbon which we can put into the atmosphere without threatening that temperature target. The Indians' argument is most of that carbon budget belongs to developing countries. It belongs to India, it belongs to Indonesia. And actually, by adopting a 2050 net zero target, rich states are actually taking more of that budget than is just under a historical perspective. So that's the first thing. So how the Green New Deal is communicated, how NAT 2050 is communicated, is going to be a very sensitive issue in parts of the developing world. That's the first point. Second, there are aspects of the Green New Deal I think are going to be contentious. I'm thinking particularly of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that I was suspecting may have come up earlier in conversation, but hasn't. So this is basically a carbon tax at the border that covers goods which are covered by the EU's own emissions trading scheme so that you can't get carbon leakage, so that foreign producers won't have unfair advantages within the EU market. But it is going to be highly contentious. It's going to look like a protectionist measure at a time when the EU is trying to retool itself to many countries. It has a clearly extraterritorial element to it of the EU trying to push its standards on there. One of the rationales behind the carbon border adjustment mechanism is that it will encourage other countries to start their own carbon markets if they haven't already. That's the sort of aspect that when you see it with US sanctions, extraterritoriality is one thing that tends to set other countries on edge. It looks like an intrusion into their sovereignty. So again, I think this is something that has to be quite carefully managed. I also wonder if it's gameable. The EU might hope that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is actually going to encourage other countries to cut their carbon, but maybe what they could do, if it's a fairly large conglomerate that you're looking at, they could simply have their lowest carbon plant geared towards exporting to the EU, and then the rest of their industry would lag somewhere behind. So CBAM, I think, is an issue. And then there are two aspects within the taxonomy that the Commissioner Dombrovskis mentioned, and I think are quite interesting. One is biomass, and the fact that the EU does not regards biomass as carbon neutral. The science around this is quite contested, Alan, because the carbon that you emit by burning wood pellets is not immediately sequestered into woods that are replanted. It's something that takes years and decades. And if we only have 20 odd years left to get to these targets, then that's certainly problematic. My worry here is more than anything that the EU sticking to a fairly expansive definition of biomass and it's acceptable is going to set a bad example for other countries. One of which, by the way, is the United Kingdom, but Korea, Japan are also places that are quite biomass fixed. Other aspect of this is whether nuclear power counts or not. This is an issue that divides the member states. We're yet to see whether nuclear is in the taxonomy. My own view is that nuclear is going to have to be part of the mix if the world is going to get there. You know, India generates 70% of its electricity by burning coal. The idea that you can use wind or solar to fully cover that gap, it seems to me, is a bit of a push. And it's also a great opportunity for Europe, because if you're looking at Europe's place in the world, when Europe goes out into the world, Europe actually has nuclear technology. It has a fantastic scientific base. So this is an area where Europe can compete with the United States. It can compete with Russia. When China gets more into the game, it can compete with China too. And if you're looking for something that is a strategic export, then this is it. I mean, beyond arms, nuclear power is just about one of the best ones. You really take a partner seriously if they're helping you to keep your lights on and also to take your own country up the scientific knowledge tree. So I think that's an excellent one there. So let's look at how some of these issues briefly might impact on a country which is a partner of the EU in terms of the Green New Deal. So let's take Russia. Russia is a country that for many years has held two contradictory and not very helpful ideas on climate change. Firstly, that the whole thing was a Western plot designed simply to deprive Russia of the fruits of its natural resources and export them so much. And at the same time, if it were to be true, it's not something that Russia should really worry about because it would open up the Northern Sea route and it would open much more Russian land to agriculture. So it would be one of the net beneficiaries. That idea, I think, is now, both those ideas have lost a lot of ground. And President Putin actually put climate as one of the priorities in his federal address in April this year. Russians accept now that there are effects at home and abroad of climate change. At home, got the melting of the permafrost is causing some quite serious losses for oil and gas. And that's something that causes Russia. It's also causes concern for Russians' leaders. It's also something that is visiting terrible harm on Russia's infrastructure and the cost of that. Beyond this immediate term, also in the south of Russia, we have the potential of more droughts, more dry seasons, and extreme weather that is going to disrupt a lot of life. And then abroad, obviously, the effects are equally significant. We're talking about the shriveling away of Russia's major exports, oil and gas. We're talking about carbon taxes, heavy carbon taxes on some other really big Russian exports, steel, aluminium, fertilizer, petrochemicals, among them. So it's highly significant. And on top of that, Russian companies, of course, the ones that are plumbed into the financial system, are exposed to the whole range of exposures of ESG. So for Russia, this is a big deal. I think Putin has finally signaled belatedly that Russia is going to have to take some action on this. Russian companies already are beginning to wonder how they can handle this new external environment, because the EU is a very important, it's a gravitational force in that way for a lot of Russian industry. So I think ultimately they probably will play along with it. Russia still has sufficient incentive to do so. So one of the questions is, can they put a mix of hydrogen and methane into those gas pipelines to help Europe solve out its energy problems when the gas sort of goes away? Obviously, there'll be more of a pivot to Asia within this, but that will be not marginal. So I think the prospects are reasonable that actually this is going to have some positive impact on Russia, but it's not going to be a very easy process to manage because, as you know, Russia is not a country that particularly enjoys it when it perceives that the Europeans are trying to tell Russia how to act, how to arrange itself domestically. And these are some things that, that inevitably are touching on very sensitive areas. One final figure for me, Alan, just on perhaps I think the most revolutionary aspect of the Green New Deal, and that's the circular economy. If we think that an electricity system powered by wind and solar and with our cars running off electricity is a real game changer, then it pales in comparison to what the circular economy might do. The idea that we move away from, not just in the interest of improving the climate, but more generally sort of heal the earth, that we go from consuming resources, making goods, and then using them, throwing them away. But we go to a system whereby everything is designed at the start to be repaired, reused, remanufactured. Is a huge change. Imagine that your smartphone is one you have for life and it's renovated along the way. You don't buy one every 2 or 3 years and then throw it on to your children. The changes, if this actually were to properly bed in to our economies, to our lives, to the prices of goods, to the patterns of consumption, will be absolutely enormous. And so I'm only beginning to start to get my head around what a big change that would be if it really gained traction.
Nick, that's very interesting. And I think you kind of underline the scale of what we're trying to do here. I mean, it is not a small thing. It is not simply about putting up a few windmills and a few solar panels. The order of magnitude of change is far greater than I think most people appreciate. I was wondering, Mr. Vice President, what you think about this broader issue about cooperation with energy partners like Russia, when they may well actually be seeing their, we're doing this Green Deal. We can see the fantastic spillover effects, and the best example I can give of that is probably electric vehicles. I mean, I think this is one of the areas where we will probably see a lot of success relatively quickly with the rollout of those. We know vehicle transport in Europe is about 6 million barrels a day of consumption. That's about a third of all the 19 million barrels a day we use. I mean, if we basically move rapidly in the direction of electric vehicles, you can see that the Russians may find it quite sort of threatening. That's 40 to 50% of federal tax revenue from the oil revenues, which we're putting under threat. And if we're doing it, the Americans are doing it, the Chinese are doing it, all more or less at the same time, driven by COP26. We can see that's an issue for them, and also it kind of is an issue for us, because surely, they are to our east, and to our south we have Saudi Arabia, and so we literally have we're solving our climate, perhaps solving our climate problems, but we're actually then resulting in significant geostrategic problems to our east and to our south. And I wonder what you have any observation or thought about that.
Thank you. And actually, there were lots of issues and points raised, so let me maybe come back to some of them. Yeah. So first, it's worth noting that EU is emitting around 8% of the global greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. So obviously, if we want to deal with climate change, it's a planetary challenge, and other countries, which are all in all amount to 92% of global emissions, must also do their part. There is clearly a historical aspect of developed countries versus developing countries, and how much emissions there had been historically accumulated. And I think that's also one of the reasons behind this climate pledge of developed countries, 100 billion euros pledge, and actually recently both EU and US have stepped up their financing towards this climate pledge to support developing countries in climate mitigation and adaptation. Mm-hmm. So clearly this is something which we also need to factor in. Then some points were raised, for example, on carbon border adjustment mechanism. Well, when designing carbon border adjustment mechanism, we were very careful to make sure that it's in line with the rules of the World Trade Organization, that we are not discriminating versus non-EU producers. So basically for energy-intensive sectors like steel and aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, cement, when we are starting to put carbon price for the EU industries, of course there is a risk of carbon leakage. So in a sense we are offsetting it with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we are doing it, so to say, in parallel. As we are phasing in carbon price for our industry, we are phasing in CBAM, so at no point providing, so to say, double protection for the EU industry. And we are ready to offset any price of carbon, for example, which is put on producers in the third country. So in a sense, if the price on carbon in the third country is equivalent to the carbon price in the EU, in this case, there is no CBAM to be paid. So it's clearly environmental measure to protect ourselves against risk of carbon leakage. Then the question on Russia, I would say in general on oil exporting countries, clearly as we transition towards carbon neutrality, we'll be phasing out fossil fuels, and it's going to be the issue. And we know that actually many of the oil exporting countries are already working on the diversification of their economies. And it must be said, it's not only the issue outside the EU, it's also an issue within the EU. We, for example, have quite a few coal regions, and as we'll be phasing out coal, of course, we need to support also those regions and people in those regions. And that's where, for example, EU's Just Transition Mechanism and Just Transition Fund comes in. So obviously, it's going to be a major transformation, and there is going to be a cost of action, both within the EU and outside the EU, but it's also clear that the cost of inaction is actually much graver for the entire world.
Sorry, David, do you want to comment?
Yes, just if I may, on 2 or 3 of the points which have come up in that. The 2050 date, of course, reflects the scientific requirements for it, and the slight risk of going significantly slower is that we end up having to achieve our net zero neutrality by 2045, which is instead of 50, in order to keep the temperatures under control. So, I mean, although there is a challenge for developing countries outside of Europe, certainly to meet some of these demands. Some of them have settled for 2060 or even closer, but whatever, I mean, in general, they're going to need every bit of the support that's out there. And Russia, which I had the chance to visit in June, has been, I think, their thoughts on climate change and climate action have been evolving over the past 2 years. And I think one of the factors, one of the drivers is, in fact, opportunities, economic opportunities. You know, there are a lot of people, not just in the oil and gas sectors, but other sectors of Russian industry and innovation are focused on the opportunities, and there's a positive motivation as well. And then I'm glad you mentioned coal, because coal is one of the star candidates for publicity at Glasgow. Glasgow's the meeting that we want to reach agreement for phase-out dates for coal for almost every coal-producing nation, and that will be a major focal point. And as the Commissioner rightly says, it's not straightforward. You have to take into account the social dimensions and integrate that aspect into the implementation of that phase-out process.
Nick, I was wondering if I could come back to Nick for a second. One of the points you made was about nuclear, and I was wondering. Obviously, there's a debate going on about the role of nuclear, financing it, and so forth. But one of the questions I have got, which I don't quite understand myself, is if we are going to reach 50% cut in emissions by 2030 on a 1990 basis, which is what the plan on the Green Deal is, the question I have got is, with what are we going to reach that target? Because, I mean, I can see that the things might work in the future, hydrogen or whatever, but in terms of if you're going to hit a target in 2030, beyond nuclear, what is there? I mean, renewables can play a significant role, but they can't do the heavy lifting. That's what my impression is. What's your view on this?
Well, I'm with you, Alan. I think probably nuclear needs to be part of the conversation, and I think President Macron probably is the one who has grasped the future of this announcement this week. The question is, how many bets on human ingenuity do you want to make? So let's say that renewables, we can achieve this from what is already a fairly high base, or at least a respectable base, a 5-fold expansion in renewable generating capacity in Europe. Can we do that given the supply chain constraints we've already got, given that CBAM is actually going to increase the price of steel and cement that we're going to need to build some of those wind turbines? It seems to me that nuclear really has to be part of that mix if we are to get there. But the transition challenge is far bigger than simply the electricity sector. We need to see big changes in industry, in agriculture, in transport, as we know, electrification of cars and lorries on the road, and residential and commercial buildings as well. So yeah, it's absolutely enormous. But so I think it's important that we acknowledge the scale of the challenge in the energy, in the electricity sector, but don't think that that is all the game, because it really isn't.
My understanding of the argument is partly that the reason why electrical power is so important is that if you're able to zero carbon electrical power, then you can confidently electrify the economy, and electrification then becomes a means of decarbonization. I think that is understanding why I think there's so much focus on it. But you're quite right. I was quite surprised when I was reading all these documents about agriculture, how far, agriculture is a CO2 fest, essentially, and also then construction and so forth. So, now, Mr. Vice President, I don't want to put you wholly on the spot, but nuclear. What do you think? I mean, there is this question, and I put this to a lot of my green friends. I say, yes, if it's a climate emergency, then yes, what do we do? Do we take the view, a bit like with the vaccine production, that we've got to create a whole series of options, one of which is this nuclear option, and then we look at everything else, and we don't stop at nuclear. We put a lot of R&D into lots of other alternatives. But if we're going to get there fast, what do we do? That's my question.
Yeah, as regards role of nuclear in this transition to the climate neutrality, European Commission is continuing to assess this question because it's clear that we need to recognize the role of nuclear as low carbon energy source. We also need to recognize the role of natural gas as a transition energy. So we are working currently on those issues. In case of nuclear, there were also several scientific reports which were recently made. So we're looking also on this do no significant harm criteria. So when we're assessing different sources of energy, we are assessing not only their carbon footprint, but also how they fit into do no significant harm criteria, where obviously there are questions related to nuclear waste and its long-term storage. But it's something which is currently under assessment in the Commission, because indeed we need not only to think how, in a sense, things will look at the end of the day, but how we also get there, and where nuclear and natural gas will also have a role to play.
So I don't know if you have any further observations on this kind of either the nuclear thing or perhaps CBAM. Do you have any?
Not so much on those, but I wanted to say that I agree with Nick that there's a whole broader agenda in terms of decarbonizing cities, building efficiency, etc. That is very important, and I think it falls under the pillar of mitigation. Yeah. I think, and those are, I mean, getting that right, taking cities, for example, is an immensely powerful way to make a contribution. Same with sustainable agriculture. So, investing time and money in those areas as well. It's just, it shouldn't be instead of the headline campaigns in terms of lowering the amount of carbon. So there's a whole sort of pie chart of factors and issues that we can go through, pretty much all of which are valid parts of the package of effectively combating climate change.
Yeah, it's such a big package in so many different parts.
That's right.
Nick, I just wanted to come back to you about this issue you were saying about India taking the view that if there's a carbon budget, it belongs to the developing world. I mean, the problem with that is that does that also put a kind of pressure on the developing world, on the developed world, to sort out its CO2 emissions issues much faster, and puts a premium not necessarily in nuclear, but looking at ways of finding alternative sources of power which are not CO2 emitting sooner rather than later. And there is a kind of almost, but a political, but also perhaps a creative tension here, which will play a significant role.
Yes. Ultimately, it's going to be a question of money, I think, Alan, technological transfer and financial transfer. Now, the promises that were made at Paris for $100 billion a year of technology transfer to developing world haven't been made. It's very difficult to get good estimates on that, but there was a World Bank one that I think came for the 2019 number being maybe 80 billion rather than the 100 billion. And almost certainly the price tag is sort of going up year by year by year. So part of a country like India is not really prepared to be constrained in its growth potential, as none of our countries were previously, simply because of a problem which actually is largely of the West's making. So it's not the case that the Indians are not prepared to come to the table, but the kind of offer, I think, has to be right there, and they're not interested in tying their hands for a problem which, as they see, is not wholly of their making. And so that I think that the technology transfer is going to be very important. It seems to me nuclear really has to be part of the mix. Southeast Asia has no nuclear power plants today, none. Indonesia will probably get there first. We'll see some floating platforms in the Sea of Java. But I say it's an area where Europe potentially can play a role. There are more nuclear reactors operating today in Belgium, Czech Republic, Sweden, and Spain than there are in all of India. And compare the population of those two groups. So I think it is an opportunity for Europe if Europe can actually resolve its internal divisions on that subject, which is why the Commissioner had to be so very careful in his answer to your previous question.
So that's quite interesting. And I can see perhaps Mr. Macron seeing a potential monumental export opportunity for the French nuclear industry, if for no one else. So
not to Australia.
Well, perhaps not to Australia. Yes, that's another question. But I think there is I don't want to focus too much on nuclear, but I think the broader issues about the spillover effects are, I actually think, really interesting. And one of the areas which I mentioned briefly before was about electric vehicles, and it seems to me that's one of the underlying questions is about maintaining public support. And I think, and obviously there are difficulties, there's a prospect of a lot of power being more expensive and more difficult. But it surely is, this is one of the questions I perhaps put to the Commissioner, is that is this a way of actually, electric vehicles is a way of obtaining public support in the sense that we believe by about 2025, the cost of electric vehicles will fall below that of internal combustion engines. So you can get a cheaper car, which is cost of running is lower, no CO2 emissions, and the result in the streets and cities of Europe is that air quality improves, and of course you have lower levels of noise. So is perhaps electric vehicles one of the ways of actually significantly building public support for the Green Deal in the short run as one of the relatively low-hanging fruit between now and 2030?
Indeed, there is a lot of work now going on in the EU on the movement towards electromobility. Already now, for example, there is substantial funding going, including through the Recovery and Resilience Facility, towards rolling out electromobility, rolling out the network of electrical charging stations on the roads. Some countries are considering providing some support for actually purchasing electrical vehicles. And as of 2030, the plan is that there would be no new vehicles allowed for sale in the EU, which are not zero tailpipe emission vehicles, which basically leaves electrical vehicles or hydrogen vehicles as well currently available options. So indeed, the move towards electromobility will be very much part of the solution, and you already outlined very well the potential benefits of that.
Yeah, and I think I was just wondering again, this brings us to the broader COP issue here, is in terms of building public support globally. I mean, is this about Western technology transfer in relation to electric vehicles, providing support to bring them out? And you can see, if we're talking about India and a carbon budget, if you've got the heavily polluted Indian cities and you can change that, that's great for the population, it's great for the government, they look fantastic. You can see a whole stack of very, very positive wins. And that may well be a way of helping build consensus at COP26.
Yeah, it's certainly a major area of work that we want to press at COP26, and including through statements that leaders can sign up to. Yeah. So, it's going to have a high profile for a lot of these reasons. I mean, it's absolutely right that the conditions need to be right to make it work with the broader infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, and the support for individuals. But the economic relative costs are changing so quickly that it becomes viable, I think, in many places faster than many people in the public expect. Mm-hmm. So it is an area to be prepared to act, and where we can, act now.
Yeah. I think act now is the kind of if you're almost like the motto of COP26, is it not?
Indeed.
It is. We've only got about 5 minutes left, and perhaps the easy thing would be to simply go around and sort of ask each of the panelists, what is the kind of key Green Deal achievable point we should be looking at for the next year? What is the thing which will perhaps make the most significant difference to achieve the sort of climate goals we have? And perhaps I could start with Nick.
Thank you. I think getting the carbon price, the key to it is going to be getting the carbon price high enough so that it hurts, it works. So you actually create the incentives to change, and you create the profit structures to make it worthwhile. I mean, we're talking about huge amounts of money that need to go into carbon sinks, need to pay for reforesting. That only works if the carbon price is right. So on the one hand, we have to make it hurt to make it work. But on the other hand, we have to not stress the tolerance of European publics and European businesses beyond breaking point. So that's a really, that's a high wire act, fine line that has to be trodden. Sorry, only other thing to say is on electrification of transport. Remember, this requires enormous investments into the electricity grid. It's not only a case of retooling that grid so it's feeding in from renewables rather than from gas from coal-fired plants. It's also the fact that on top of all the existing electricity demand, you're now going to have to deal with the entire road fleet as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a really big, the win-win that you were suggesting was a great one, but the investments, again, are really staggering to get there.
Yeah, that's good. I suppose what you're really saying is that this is the climate change equivalent of no pain, no gain. But it's true about the scale. It's the scale. So I don't know. So turning to you, do you think, Dave, what do you think is the what is the kind of the thing we really have to go for choose one thing?
I would say this, wouldn't I? But coal. I would say making a real difference in terms of tackling coal and addressing the social aspects creates a sort of impact which we need if we're going to have the size of impact, that if we have fast movement to our goals, So that's an answer in a European context, but also in a much wider context. And I must say I'm working with a lot of countries within and beyond Europe on precisely this issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the final word to Mr. Vice President.
First thing I would say it's not to be discouraged by the scale and complexity of the task, because we are discussing here and we listen to all the complexity, all the issues. One can even really get discouraged. But we need to start moving forward. Like every long journey starts with the first step. Probably will not get everything right with the first go. We'll have to adjust our approach as we are moving forward. But it's important that we are moving forward. And a second aspect, I'm glad also both other speakers mentioned, it's a social aspect. They will be only successful with the goals of European Green Deal if we will do in a way that it's socially acceptable, in a way that leaves no one behind. So we must pay utmost attention to this.
Right. Well, on that positive note, I think we conclude, and perhaps a reasonable round of applause for a very interesting and stimulating panel.